Seth, welcome back to the podcast, man.
Thanks for having me on. It's always a blast. So looking forward to this one.
Yeah, cool, man. You're actually the first guest we're going to have back, so
nice.
Congratulations on that.
Very honored.
I want to go through, so as you know, with the Bitcoin had ordinals, Monero had modinals, and I started to see a lot of FUD from Bitcoiners, and really like very low quality FUD too, FUD that's really been debunked for quite a while, and that's why I got yourself on, was to debunk that FUD, because obviously on your website, anyone who wants to check it out, it is sethforprivacy.com, and he has a post dispelling Monero FUD. So we're going to go through a few of those today and put the Bitcoin maxis back in their place. So we'll start with a pretty easy one. It's actually the first one on your blog post. So Monero has an infinite supply. That's the claim. So take us through it.
Yeah, so this is one of those where usually the best FUD has a thread of truth to it. So with this one, it's technically true. Monero does technically not have a hard cap like Bitcoin. I like to call Bitcoin's hard cap an arbitrary hard cap because there was no purpose behind the 21 million number. It just happened to be the max integer size that he chose for the number of coins. So there's no real purpose behind it. That's just what was set. So with Monero, we don't have an arbitrary hard cap. What we have something called a tail emission. So there's a defined supply of 18.4 million Monero. When that's done, which that finished last May, actually. So we're in this point called tail emission. All of this was defined from very, very early days in Monero. None of this changed. We didn't change and add the tail emission in last May, just to clarify, because that was another FUD point that came up in the middle of that. But basically what happens is we hit this defined supply, we hit what's called the tail emission period, and that means that with every block in Monero, from that point on, 0.6 Monero are emitted in the block subsidy. So just like how Bitcoin has a block subsidy of 6.25 Bitcoin right now, Monero has 0.6 XMR forever. That will never go down to zero. That will always stay at 0.6 XMR. So technically what that means is that Monero is disinflationary, at least. In reality, it's most likely deflationary, because the amount of lost coins per year usually is estimated to like 1 to 4%, somewhere around there. And Monero's inflation rate is already below that with the tail emission, and will constantly be approaching 0%. So while it's technically true that Monero has an infinite supply, it is for a purpose of security, so that their miners will always know that there's a lower bound of Monero that they'll earn when they're mining blocks. It provides some security against some interesting attacks that can happen if you have zero block subsidy, and it ensures that new entrants can always gain Monero through mining Monero. So
even if it had a limited supply, to make the argument, you still can't even audit the supply.
Oh yeah, that's a fun one. So this one, again, is a tricky one. There's always nuance behind these things. This one has a thread of truth in that auditing Monero is more difficult, but the supply of Monero absolutely can be audited. So the difference between Bitcoin and Monero is, with Bitcoin, because every transaction, the amounts are totally transparent. Every UTXO in Bitcoin's UTXO set is totally transparent. In theory, I could whip out my TI-84, go through the UTXO set and sum up all the UTXOs and know the supply of Bitcoin and validate it myself. In practice, literally no one does that. I've never heard anyone who's actually done the napkin math to figure that out. So what you do in Bitcoin is you trust Bitcoin D or Bitcoin Core to sum up the UTXO set for you and tell you what the supply is. So there's trust inherent there, but obviously it's fairly simple because you're just summing up the UTXOs. Nothing too crazy. In Monero, because in every transaction the amount is completely hidden, no one can see it except the participants in the transaction. Obviously, that provides excellent privacy, and it enables a lot of the rest of the privacy that happens by default in Monero. But what that does mean is that you can't just go through and look at the transactions, look at the UTXOs, and sum up the UTXO set. So I can't whip out my TA84 and do it. But what I can do still in Monero is I can run Monero D, I can run a simple command, wait a few seconds, and Monero D will check all the transactions in the history, check the coins that have emitted through mining, and it'll make sure that no coins have been emitted incorrectly throughout that process. What it can't technically check is if there was a cryptography flaw or some sort of implementation flaw where the amount hiding itself was broken. And that is just a piece of the difference with Monero. You gain really strong privacy, but you do have a little bit of a risk there. Now, to be clear, Monero has chosen to be very cautious with the cryptography that we use. We've implemented very well vetted stuff, lots of audits, pretty much as much due diligence as you can do. That doesn't mean there's zero risk, but it means that there's a very, 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 very small risk, likely zero cryptography risk, and likely just a very small percentage of an implementation risk for someone to be able to inflate the supply without us being able to notice it. But even in the few cases that we have seen where there was some sort of bug, even that has always been detectable to the specific way that they've worked in the past. So it's something where you can audit Monero. It's more difficult. It requires a little bit more trust and a little bit more complex cryptography, but you don't have to trust some other person. You can do it on your own code. Code is open source.
So take us through like what actually, how you're actually able to audit the supply of Monero. So, for example, explain range proofs, explain Pedersen commitments if you can, and because obviously you talk about like the risk of cryptography, but as far as I'm aware, things like Pedersen commitments are highly tested, highly trusted.
Yeah. So really quickly, the way that hiding amounts works within Monero is the amount is completely cryptographically hidden. But in order for that to work, we need the person who's creating a transaction to be able to prove that the amount of funds that they're spending and the amount of funds that are being received by themselves or whoever's receiving funds at the other end, plus transaction fees, that it all adds up properly. That you're not creating any funds, that you're not destroying any funds, that you're properly spending Monero and someone else is properly receiving Monero. Exact same thing we do in Bitcoin. But obviously in Monero, the amounts are hidden, so we can't just do that simple check. So what happens is when you go to create a transaction, your Monero wallet creates a commitment, often called a range proof, which is a Pedersen commitment as part of the range proof. And what you do is you provide a proof that is cryptographically sound, that the transaction that you're making is legitimate, that the inputs and outputs balance. And you can only create that proof if it's actually true. It's what's called a zero knowledge proof. So you can prove something that you don't actually reveal to miners, to anyone else who sees that transaction on the blockchain. Like I said, it's using very well-known, well-trusted cryptography. None of it is crazy. That's one of the reasons why we've been very slow on implementing something like Zcash uses, because we want to be cautious with this, and we have. So the cryptography itself is very well understood, very well trusted. Really, the only potential problem, in my mind, comes in when it comes to implementation, in that when we implement the code that actually implements that cryptography, there could be flaws there that allows some sort of way to create a proof that looks legitimate but isn't. But there's no way to do that within the cryptography itself, and obviously a lot of attention has been paid to the actual implementation there. And the beauty of open source with Monero as well is there have been many, many forks, many projects that have looked at Monero, built on it, and they all are using that code, verifying it, checking it as well. So we have a lot of eyes on the code to make sure that doesn't happen. It's just not something where I can guarantee that it can't happen. It's just a very well understood, relatively straightforward cryptography approach to this problem.
So far we've discovered why Monero is a shitcoin, because it's got an infinite supply. We've talked about, again, how you can't audit the supply, but now I want to talk about why it's centralized and how the Monero core controls Monero and implements hard forks on everybody every 6 months. So take us through that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is a fun one. I think this is the one that I usually find people kind of falling back to if none of the other FUD is sticking. And essentially the point is normally that Monero just hard forks constantly. Every 6 months we hard fork, no real reason, no real benefit. Obviously the truth is very different from that FUD. And essentially what Monero as a community has chosen is that we are going to allow Monero to be upgraded over the long term, slowly, cautiously, with audits, with lots of eyes on the code. But we're going to do this so that we can continue to improve the transaction privacy of the transaction protocol itself. We've done it in the past. We don't do it anymore to improve the decentralization of mining by ensuring that there's not one ASIC company or one manufacturer controlling the issuance of miners or controlling mining itself. And we do this as well to implement new features and new improvements as we go along. Things like Seraphis that's being worked on right now will be implemented through a hard fork. Hard forks are kind of necessary evil if you're talking about blockchains. Bitcoin is the same thing. Essentially what a hard fork does is it allows you to ensure that everyone on the network updates to follow the current set of rules. So it sounds a lot scarier than it is. Really, just what it means is if you want to keep using Monero with the software that's being developed by all of the hundreds and hundreds of Monero developers, you continue to follow this chain after it forks at this point. And that's just upgrading those consensus rules. So like an example would be when we implemented RandomX on the Monero network to ensure decentralization, to ensure you being able to mine on commodity hardware, just spinning up your desktop, mining Monero. That happened through a hard fork. And that meant that at that point, the consensus rules changed. And in order to mine Monero after that point, you had to start mining with this RandomX algorithm. This process is not centralized. It does not happen behind closed doors. This happens always through public meetings, always discussion on GitHub, IRC, email. There are many, many ways that you can keep up and stay involved with this. And anyone who wants to contribute, to have a voice, etc., can jump in there. Anyone who wants to contribute code can do so. All of this is done out in the open. So it's definitely something that I think scares a lot of Bitcoiners because it's very much anathema to the Bitcoin ethos at this point, unfortunately. But hard forks are something where like I would love it if we didn't need to do them, but it is the only way to make consensus changes within a blockchain. And when you're building something that is software and something that is supposed to provide strong privacy, you are going to have to upgrade that over the long term. It's just always going to be an arms race when it comes to privacy. And so you need the ability to improve the privacy over the long term. And that's what Monero has done. At this point, we hard fork at most once every couple of years. That's quickly slowing down, probably be 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years soon. And as we kind of mature the protocol and build it out, that will continue to slow down. It's not regularly scheduled. It's not centralized. No private board behind closed doors are deciding these things.
And look, even if Monero works, it doesn't matter because governments are going to ban Monero anyway.
I love this one because if you're looking at Bitcoin as a tool to subvert and opt out of a broken system, ultimately you're looking at a tool that governments are going to want to ban or control. If they can control it, obviously they'd love to do that. If they can prevent you from using it as a way to opt out, they'd love to do that. They don't want to have to ban things. They'd much rather co-opt things, control things, and charge taxes. Like that would make them very happy. So when we look at Bitcoin as well as Monero, if it's working properly to give us power over the state rather than giving the state power over us, governments are going to want to stop it. And so when I hear that from Bitcoiners, it confuses me because I think oftentimes people think that somehow we're just going to kind of get along with the state, even though we're replacing the money that gives them all of their power over the long term. And it's just going to be kind of a happy dance off into the sunset with nation states. And that's just not the case. We're already seeing much more adversarial environment in the last year here. So when we look at Monero, while it's possible the governments will ban Monero, it's never happened so far. There is no outright legislation or regulation that prevents you from buying, using, or holding Monero. It is totally legal and above board. What we have seen is governments use basically shadowy back channels with banks to tell banks you shouldn't deal with any exchange that supports Monero. So that can prevent large centralized exchanges that require your personal ID from giving you Monero, which in the short term, I think feels a little painful, but ultimately it pushes people towards peer-to-peer exchanges where they're buying and selling Monero directly with other Monero people. And they're avoiding the dangers of KYC anyways. So there's honestly hidden benefits in being banned. And the whole point of these things is we've built these systems so that they can work with or without the state's approval. Same is true of Bitcoin, same is true of Monero. Anything that's seeking decentralization should not care if it's banned or allowed. And we shouldn't build for it to be allowed and just get scared when suddenly some kind of pressure comes in. So obviously Monero could get banned. Who cares? As long as I can still send you Monero, you can still send me Monero. As long as I can buy it somewhere, I'm happy.
As long as it's still fungible, right?
Exactly, which it always will be. That's the beautiful thing.
Right. Another one, let's hit you with it. Monero can't scale. I like this one personally.
Yeah, so this one's, again, it's one of those pieces of FUD that has a thread of truth, but ultimately I think is simplifying something far too much. So when you look at Monero, I think a lot of the easy responses to it is that it can't scale because transactions are larger within Monero. But this misses two major things. The first thing that it misses is that Monero has drastically improved in efficiency over the years and continues to improve in efficiency. There's already another efficiency improvement that's being worked on right now called Bulletproof++. So judging Monero today and predicting that it can never scale is already missing the point. This community will continue to upgrade Monero as we have good improvements to make to it. But even if you look at Monero today and you look at the privacy that it provides per transaction, It's actually the most efficient privacy protocol that we have. It's more efficient than Zcash. It's more efficient than the most well-known, well-trusted privacy approach on Bitcoin. And that's because every transaction in Monero is private by default. You don't have to make extra transactions to gain privacy. You don't have to jump through extra hoops. You make a transaction, you gain strong privacy by default. And so even though an individual transaction in Bitcoin, in Monero, is a good bit bigger than in Bitcoin, somewhere between 3 to 4 times, it depends exactly on what transactions you're looking at, it's providing privacy that would require even more storage on chain if you were to use the privacy tools that we have on Bitcoin today. So it is actually very efficient. Ultimately, I'm one of the people who doesn't think that Monero will scale to like world status on layer 1. Same with Bitcoin, same with anything. Using a network that can't forget anything and that needs to remember everything that ever happens on the network for the entire world's transactions is just a bad idea. It's never going to work. It's not going to work for Bitcoin, not going to work for anything else. What can help there is implementing some sort of a layer 2 network. And I've talked about this at length in the past. I also have a section on that in the blog post. But ultimately, in Bitcoin, we have the Lightning Network, which poses as a good scaling and privacy technology. Still a lot of kinks to work out, but it's an interesting concept that hopefully will continue to mature and improve. We can implement something like that in Monero. It's a little bit trickier because we don't have scripting with Monero, but there's already been, I think, 6 different research papers with approaches to actually handling it. And 2 of those are really solid and seem like they would be workable solutions that could be implemented. So even if we do grow to the scale where there are many, many, many people around the world using Monero, and doing that on layer 1 isn't tenable, we can implement a layer 2 network like the Lightning Network, and we can scale that way. So it's another one of those situations where Monero's developer community is absolutely brilliant. The research community is absolutely brilliant. They're working on solutions to this. Monero is constantly improving. But even today, Monero scales better than any other privacy technology when it comes to cryptocurrencies.
It's probably a good segue, actually, because a lot of Bitcoiners say that, well, let's get the piece of FUD up. So a lot of Bitcoiners say that Bitcoin is as private as, if not more private than Monero. So what do you got to say about that?
It depends. It's hard with Bitcoin because the way that most people use Bitcoin, it is not private at all. It has very fragile pseudonymity, I think is the best way to describe Bitcoin. In many cases, it doesn't even have that. If you've bought on a KYC exchange and withdrawn to your wallet, you don't even have fragile pseudonymity. In practice, with good privacy tools on Bitcoin, you can gain, I think, good enough privacy in comparison to Monero. Good enough for most use cases. But that involves using specific tools, making multiple transactions to gain that privacy. It involves a lot of active coin control. It involves post-mix spending tools where after you gain privacy, you have to spend in a certain way to continue to preserve that privacy. It's something where it's doable. And I mean, I'm working right now on how we can improve that process. It's something that I definitely see a long-term improvement there, but it's difficult. And when you do achieve it, it's difficult to retain that privacy when you're actually spending Bitcoin. The Lightning Network presents an interesting solution to that problem, maybe. Right now, Lightning privacy is pretty bad in most scenarios, but there are good proposals that have already been made to improve Lightning privacy and give it very good privacy, likely better than Bitcoin on-chain. I would say in the real world analogous to Monero's privacy. In some ways better. One of the beautiful things about a layer 2 network like Lightning is the ephemerality, and that the transactions that you make are not stored for forever. No one has a record published and globally available of every transaction that happens. And so unless there's an active adversary surveilling transactions, that information is just gone once the transactions themselves happen. So there are benefits there. There is the potential that it could be at least as good as Monero's layer 1 privacy, but it's just potential. And I am very hesitant as a privacy advocate to bet on potential, and I want to see those things actually built out. So there's a lot of promise, but right now for the average person, Monero is far more private because it provides the tools that you need for privacy by default in every transaction, no matter what wallet you use. Whereas with Bitcoin, you need to use the right wallets, use them in the right ways, not shoot yourself in the foot. It's a lot trickier.
So just to hit you with a piece of Bitcoin FUD right now, tell me why I'm wrong. So One of the privacy tools on Bitcoin is obviously CoinJoins. So with CoinJoins, I believe you have 10 people or 11 people in the transaction, right? That's correct. Firstly,
It depends. And the main implementation that like I normally recommend, it's 5 people.
so if you have whatever the number is, let's say you have 5 for ease of maths. You have you, 4 other people. One other person sends their newly mixed coins to a KYC exchange, right? So that can be, I suppose, allocated to that person. We know this UTXO now belongs to this person. So now instead of your anonymity set being 1 out of 5, your anonymity set is 1 out of 4. So in essence, what you're doing, right, is you're essentially relying on other people for your privacy, right? Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, no, you are right. And that's one of the difficulties really in any network. I mean, the same is true of Monero, but the beautiful thing in Monero is it's not a collaborative transaction. When you spend, you gain privacy from people that don't have to choose to participate there. So you gain a lot better plausible deniability in Monero, and you gain per transaction a larger anonymity set. Anonymity sets are really hard when you're looking at one transaction. You're not looking backwards or forwards. But in Monero, we have 15 decoys. You can look at that as 15 other potential paths backwards in history for each input to a transaction. And in something like Samurai Whirlpool, which is the 5 in, 5 out transaction, you are 1 out of 5. So essentially you have a 1 in 5 anonymity set. The unique thing about Samurai Whirlpool is they incentivize you to continue mixing over the long term and keeping those outputs fresh with new entrants and continually regaining that privacy. So that does deal with a lot of the issues of other people harming their own privacy, harming you, but it doesn't make it null and void. The same is somewhat true of Monero as well, though, in that, I mean, a lot of the discussions around this, the Mordinals kind of craze that for some reason has taken over, that does pose issues for privacy within Monero for similar reasons, in that specific outputs will be known and tagged. And if you choose one of those outputs as one of the decoys in your transaction, you do lower your anonymity set. It would be very hard for you to lower your anonymity set enough to be problematic, but it is possible in Monero. So it's always one of the difficult things when you have a limited anonymity set. That's one of the reasons why I would love to see Monero implement a global anonymity set through something like the trustless ZK snarks that Zcash have developed. Just taking that very specific piece of the protocol and replacing ring signatures would solve all of these problems. If Mordinals wanted to do stuff on Monero, it would still be terrible for scaling. It shouldn't happen. It's dumb. But if they did, it wouldn't harm the fungibility or the privacy of anyone else. So that's one of those things that will be helpful. And that's one of those things that unfortunately you'll never have on Bitcoin, because we'll never have that type of major consensus change happening in Bitcoin. So that concept will always be there, and you'll always have to worry about what other people who are involved in your privacy tool do, because they could harm your privacy.
And so the next piece of FUD I have is from possibly the most toxic maxi, which is Alex Svetsky, right? Shout out to Svetsky if you're watching. He says that decentralization is tied to economic cost. So take us through that one.
Yeah, so we were talking a little bit before we went live, and I think the important thing for people to separate is security is not necessarily decentralization. And if you look purely at like hash rate or energy that's being put into securing a network like Bitcoin versus being put into securing a network like Monero, if you do just the raw comparison, obviously Bitcoin has far more energy usage in actually securing the chain, which is a great thing. Obviously, we want that. I would love for Monero to have far more miners than it does right now. That's good for everyone. But the thing with security is that it's not necessarily tied to decentralization. So with with Bitcoin, one of the main problems with mining is that it is ASIC mined. That's not as much of an issue as I think many in the Monero community make it out to be for Bitcoin specifically, because they were able to gracefully go from CPU to GPU to ASIC mining. There's many manufacturers. There's wide distribution of ASICs. It's not really a problem from the hardware perspective, but where it is a problem is that hardware is specifically built for mining Bitcoin. So it can only be used for that. That means that it's much easier for nation states to prevent import or export of ASICs. It's a lot easier for nation states to detect and stop people from being able to mine Bitcoin, because there's higher energy usage per ASIC, and you can't say that that ASIC is for something else. It's obviously meant for mining Bitcoin. It can only mine Bitcoin, and so there's no plausible deniability with it. That's going to make it a lot harder if there's an adversarial environment for Bitcoin mining to continue. And we've already seen a massive crackdown on mining in China, and people cheered that on, thinking it would help decentralization of mining as far as geography goes within Bitcoin. But really all that did was it shifted a large portion of the hash rate from China into the US, which is not really any better. The US, I'm sure, would love to control Bitcoin mining as well. They maybe have to be a little bit more careful about how they do it. It's not quite as totalitarian, but the same issues apply there. And so within Bitcoin, mining is done large ASIC farms by large companies who are regulated. They have shareholders. They have people that they need to pay. And so regulation and nation states can quickly pressure those entities. I'm not saying they can shut down Bitcoin or control Bitcoin necessarily, but there's a lot more risk because of how centralized mining Bitcoin is into a few pools, just like Monero, actually. Monero is fairly centralized as far as how many pools there are and what kind of the distribution of hash rate is. But it's a lot easier in Bitcoin for nation states to go after these large regulated entities. Whereas when you look at Monero, Monero is mined by commodity hardware. If the government came in and asked me what my computer is for, it's a computer. Like, I use it for work, I use it for school, anything. There are tons of other uses. Could I also be mining Monero on it? Sure. I could have that software, I could not. But there is obviously plausible deniability about what I have a computer or a smartphone or a laptop for. So you have that plausible deniability. A government's not going to be able to prevent people from importing or exporting computers or smartphones. Never going to happen. Those are just ubiquitous at this point in time. So we have security from the hardware perspective. And then the other beautiful thing is that we have decentralization in geography because we don't have these massive mining farms. There are some downsides to that in that we also have lower hash rate and so therefore theoretically lower security. But there is better decentralization as far as how hash rate is distributed. So it's hard because you need to break those two things apart. Like if I had to say which is more secure, I would probably say Bitcoin is more secure against mining attacks than Monero. If I had to say which is more decentralized, I would say Monero is probably more decentralized in mining than Bitcoin. So it's tricky. There's a lot of nuance, but I think those things kind of have to be separated and viewed independently. And then you kind of have to look at the whole. Because if there's a ton of security, but it's all centralized, do you really have security? And if there's no security, but it's decentralized, do you really have security? And so I think there's a lot of kind of more tricky discussions you have to get into at that point.
Love it, man. Let's hit you with the last one. So obviously one that comes up all the time is talking about either, Monero's price, the low market cap, low liquidity, whatever you want to call it, right? So hit us with that one.
Yeah, I think the biggest one there is I normally hear people talking about how like the low liquidity is a problem for people. And yet I've never met a person in real life or online who's been like, I wanted to buy Monero, but I couldn't because there wasn't enough liquidity. Yes, if you're a mega whale and you want to buy $50 million worth of Monero, that's probably going to be trickier than it is with Bitcoin. And it will be trickier than it is with Bitcoin. Yes, does Bitcoin probably have more liquidity in peer-to-peer exchanges than Monero does? I think so. But for people who are seeking freedom through a tool like Monero, I've never heard of the liquidity being a problem for them. I really think it's kind of a fairy tale, and looking at it from the perspective of like institutional investors, which we should not be worried about when we're designing these tools or using these tools. So for me, liquidity is kind of a moot point. Market cap, we've seen lots and lots of things have very high market caps that are complete and utter scams. So that's just another one where there's no real metric to that. I think the things that I try to look at are, can I use this tool for freedom? Just everything else aside, can I use this tool for freedom? Is this tool secure enough for my transactions? And then can I buy or sell this when I need to? And if those three things are met, I think you're good. I don't think you need to worry about liquidity or market cap. And I guess the fourth is really, can I spend this thing to buy goods and services? And that's where Monero, really outside of Bitcoin, Monero is rapidly gaining acceptance far faster than Bitcoin, but much lower overall total acceptance than Bitcoin at merchants. But there's a massive push for merchant acceptance of Monero, which means that I can buy it, I can sell it. It's liquid enough for me. I've never had problems, never heard anybody who's had problems. I can make transactions privately very easily. I can buy a lot of goods and services with Monero, and that's quickly improving. And those things are most important. I really think the liquidity angle is one of those where it's just kind of pointless because it's not a realistic piece of FUD. Maybe if you're a mega whale and you have a ton of money, you'd have a problem. But at that point, just buy slowly.
The funny thing about that piece of FUD too is, like, I've been in Bitcoin for a little bit. I've been in Bitcoin since the market cap was $20 billion, and I remember the exact same FUD for Bitcoin back in 2015. So it's funny to see.
It all comes around.
That's right. It's funny to see it come back around. Seth, you've been a legend, man. I've still got a few more pieces of FUD that I'd like to throw at you, but we've run out of time, so I'd like to get you back on another time. I'm sure we'll have many more podcasts in the future. But thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Love these rapid fire episodes.
Pleasure.